All right, so I'm recording this podcast pretty early in the morning, much earlier than I usually record podcasts. And I'll come to why I'm doing that in the course of the podcast. I'll explain why I had to say that and why I'm doing this at this time of the morning. It's almost 7 o'clock, so it's six something right now. So it's quite early. A lot of times when I come to record, it's almost about 9 o'clock. Now, I have a mentee. His name is Kevin. And one reason why I like talking with Kevin a lot is because Kevin always he always approaches me with very honest questions. And very honest questions make very good questions. People don't know this. The questions that are thought out a lot of times are a bit too complex because your thoughts have muddled with it. But the honest ones are the ones that come from the soul. And so he can ask very good questions because they are honest. And I appreciate this about him. So I always try to tell him, I like the fact that you ask questions almost like a child, where people, a lot of people have this issue. They have questions, but they feel, I think I'm the only one that has this question because it's silly. But you realize that the silly questions are the ones that always go unaired. So the silly questions, a lot of them are the questions that people have no answers to. So I'm saying this because I want to appreciate Kevin, and I want to use to inspire somebody to if that you have those questions, ask those questions, ask those questions. Um, they are good questions. So Kevin asked me this question yesterday, and it's a good question. And he said, "Why is it such a hard and complex thing hearing from God? Why? Is God not our Father?" I know me and Colin were having a conversation before he asked me this question. And while we were having a conversation, my young son was beside me and he was just chatting away. And Kevin said, as he heard my son in the background, he said, "But look at how close I am to my son. And my son can hear every word I'm saying. If God is our Father, why is it so hard to hear Him? Why is it so hard to hear God? Why do people, a lot of people say, oh, I'm trying to hear God. How do I know the voice of God? Like my son right now, he knows my voice. He knows my voice. He doesn't have to struggle. He doesn't have to learn. Why is it so hard? Not like I never heard this question before because people ask me this question a lot, but then he said it with such honesty. And, he said it with such honesty and frustration. You see, he was not trying to be pious or trying to have reverence for God. He said it with some honesty. I could hear the honesty. Why? Why? God says He loves us and is our Father. Why? Why? Why does He have to put this mist between us and Him that makes it so hard to identify Him? And so, as He said it, I started to speak to Him, but I wasn't thinking of the words. It was later after that I listened to our conversation and I was ministered to as well. And we struggle to hear God mainly because of our sin. sin. But when we put it that way, it sounds highly religious. When I say sin, sin, sounds highly religious. So then our minds go to fornication, adultery, lying, killing, stealing, jealousy, envy, all those things. But it doesn't start from that. Those things are even the small fry. Those are the easy to identify sin. I tell you, I do gardening, and since I've been gardening, I realized something that you never need to plant the weeds. The weeds plant themselves. You never need to water the weeds. The weeds can grow without water. The weeds are there to compete with what you've planted. But there's something interesting. Since I've been gardening, I realized that there are two different types of weeds. There is the obvious weed, and there is also the complex weed. The obvious weeds are the ones that grow beside whatever you've planted, and they look different. So the things that you plant, maybe you're planting a vegetable with broad leaves, and a weed will grow right beside it, almost like elephant grass. It will grow with thin, narrow leaves. So it will grow with thin leaves. The thing you are planting would have yellow flowers. The weed would have purple flowers. So you can easily pick out the weeds. You just know this thing is not this. You pick them out. Those are the obvious weeds. Then you have the complex weeds. Those are the kind of intelligent ones. For some reason, they have some intelligence. Whatever you plant, it's almost like they can mimic that plant. So you look at it and they look very similar. There's one I have in my garden. When you plant, when I planted ewedu, some of you might not know ewedu is a vegetable that is very common with Yoruba people. It's common in Nigeria anyway, but mostly eaten by Yoruba people. When you plant it, right beside that ewedu, it will start growing like ewedu. It looks like ewedu. It looks like it, and it always grows around ewedu. Do you understand? So at first, when the ewedu started to grow, I couldn't tell the difference. It's when they grew, when it has grown very high or matured a little bit, that you now begin to know, oh, this is not it. But by that time, it has shared a lot of the nutrients, a lot of the resources with the ewedu. They're the complex one. So when we look at sin, you see the easy to identify ones are the lying, stealing, killing, adultery, fornication. You know, those ones you can see them from afar and can identify them. A lot of people that have grown in faith can easily sidestep these ones. You've grown in your relationship with God, you can sidestep them. You see them coming, you can see them from afar. They are different from the fruits. But then there are the more complicated ones that look just like faith, but they are far from it. This is the sin that stops us from hearing God's voice. One such sin was the first sin of man, which is the sin of intellect and logic. The sin of intellect and logic, the sin of judgment, the sin of analysis. All these things sum up to the sin of pride, the sin to be independent. Not very obvious, is it? It's hard to tell when you are beginning to lean into this sin, because it almost seems like you are functioning like a normal human being by being rational, logical, trying to be independent, trying to go the road on your own, trying to figure things out. It almost seems, trying to investigate things, it almost seems like you are growing as a human, but we don't understand that we are devolving as God's children. This is the biggest sin. This is the biggest sin. The sin of intellect and logic. This is the sin that separated Adam and Eve from God, and it's still the sin that separates us from God. It is the sin that muffles God's voice. It is the one that muffles God's voice. And in the long run, it's the one that gives birth to the more obvious sins like lying, killing, stealing, jealousy, envy, all those things. It's a sin of intellect. It's a sin of the knowledge of good and evil. When we begin to think this is good for our lives, this is bad for our lives, this is how I want to go, this is what I want to do, this is better, this is no. When we begin to think it without God. The sin of dependence, of independence, sorry, not dependence, of independence. That's the biggest sin. This is called the sin of doubt. It's the sin of doubt. That's the sin that stops us from hearing God, that stops us from knowing God. God never moved, we did. We constantly do when we think our way through life. This is how we do when we want to free ourselves from God. And this is what Adam and Eve did. So the sin didn't start with the eating. The sin started with the questioning. Does God really want the best for us? You see, when God brought Adam and Eve to the garden, when He created them in the garden or put them in the garden, He didn't bring them to the garden. They woke up in the garden. You understand? They never asked how anything was made. They never asked how anything was made. Do you know they never even asked what they were there for? That's why I talk about those slight sin, what they are there for. And I'm talking to myself. Do you know, even asking yourself, what am I here for? What did you create me for? Do you know it's a distortion from God's will? What did you create me for? How many of us ask ourselves that question? I would think it's a really righteous thing to do. To question, God, just tell me why. Do you understand? How many characters in the Bible do you see that ask God that question? Why am I here? Not Moses, not Gideon, not David, not Jesus, not John the Baptist, not Mary. Not why am I here? But you see, in self-analysis and self-help, first thing they ask you is to ask yourself why you are here. That's a logical question. You are beginning to go into logic and analysis. And then we expect to hear God. But have you ever realized that the more you ask why you are here, the more you strain to hear God? We are not meant to ask why we are here, man. We are just meant to be. And then by being, God reveals. Adam was just in the garden, and God revealed His purpose to him. The more we investigate, the more we begin to move away from God. It's the investigation. Those are the weeds that kind of look like the thing that is planted. It's hard to tell. It is that questioning. Why? You see, when God put Adam and Eve, they never asked why they are there. They just appreciated being there, and God revealed what they were to do. They just trusted God with every expression, that the expression answered the why. When God told them, don't eat from this tree, when you eat from it, you will die, they never asked, why did you put this tree there if you knew we were going to die? You see, it's us that ask when rationality started to pervade the earth. We started looking at the Bible and say, if God really loves, why would He put something that will harm them there? But the people that were there never asked God. And so if you really love us, why did you put this thing there? Are you trying to test us? No, they just didn't care. They just took God, hook, line, and sinker. Hook, line, and sinker is what is called faith. That's why God is so happy with children. Little children. He says little children, because even as children begin to grow, they become rational and ask, what we call intelligent questions. But we human beings, we are happier. We become happy with people and proud of people the more they question, and become more frustrated the more they seem to be unquestioning. But God thinks differently. That's why God says the way we think is different from the way He thinks. So when we begin to see our children ask more intelligent questions, in quote, oh, why is this like this? Oh, what is this? Oh, why is this? You're like, oh, I'm so proud, my boy is growing. But when they're not doing anything and they're looking at the flower, putting flour in their mouth, playing with sand, not questioning anything, it's still like an infant type kind of thing. That exactly is when God is happy with us spiritually. Don't when we're asking, why is this? What is this? How should this? Where is this? Why the Bible tells us, Jesus tells us, the Father knows what you need. So ask that question, what will we eat? Where will we go? What will we wear? When we start to figure out our provision and try to figure out our protection and try to figure out our path, That is sin. Sin is not that ugly monster that we always think it is, that makes us feel guilt. Sin is that ugly monster that separates us from God. And sometimes we don't even feel guilt. The biggest evidence of sin is stress and unsatisfaction or dissatisfaction, not guilt. We hammer too much on guilt, but it's dissatisfaction. It just doesn't satisfy. So God doesn't really talk about when you feel guilty. No, he talks about satisfied. That's why when Jesus talks, he talks about the bread that you eat, that you don't feel hungry again, the water that you drink, that you don't feel thirsty again. Every other thing will still leave you thirsty and hungry. That is the biggest evidence of sin. It is not guilt. Because I will have you know that some people they live in systems that are so used to doing particular things that they don't see it as guilty bad anymore. So I'll put it this way. You know, some cultures are like, if you look at racism, early racism, whether in the West, when they used to lynch black people and kill black people and hang them from trees. Do you know a lot of young children just look at black people hanging from trees and it's like you're killing a cockroach? You understand? They don't feel guilt. Black people hanging from trees was not something you felt guilt about as a young child. So you saw it growing up. It was not, you were inundated. You were orientated into it. So they didn't feel guilt. So when told that is bad, they're like, but are you sure this isn't bad? I don't feel bad about it. So guilt is not the ultimate evidence of deviation from God. It is content. It is discontent. And what happened? You'll see that no matter how many black people they killed during that Jim Crow era or the KKK hung from trees, they were never enough. That's the problem. That's when you know you deviated. When it's not enough. Do people feel guilt when they have money? No. But the guilt, the sin of money comes from when it's never enough. So when you have 1 million, you're already thinking of the next million. That's when you realize that there's a deviation from God with that money. It is the dissatisfaction. And that's why we realize that no matter how much we chase intellect and ask why, what, why, the questions just increase and increase. You understand? They just increase. It brings discontent. Discontent. The first day your child starts asking questions, he will ask questions till he dies. Once that innocence is broken, till you die, and the questions will just increase and get more complex. Because questions never satisfy. Rationalization is never satisfied. Never. Separates us from God. That's why, see, rationalization is the root of doubt. That's why doubt is the biggest sin. Doubt is the biggest sin. Doubt makes you feel you are on your own. So I must figure out my way. So it leads to pride. And pride leads to downfall. You understand? Because you will never find your way. And that's why the Bible is so against doubt. It says, without faith, we cannot please God. When we read this scripture, we don't understand what it means to please. So we think about emotional please. You understand? We're thinking about emotions. We think a lot in the Greco-Roman way. So I'm trying to reel us back into what we call the Hebrew Jewish way. So we think about emotions. Please, I'm happy with you. I'm happy. You understand? So because the Romans were very, physically sensual people. So please. But when you look at the Jewish origin of this word, please, I want to show you what the Bible meant when it said please God without faith. There is a word there, I can't get the original verb, but it says it's the same root as ratzon. 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 Meaning will or desire. So it's implying that to please someone is to align with their will or desire. So what it means, what God is saying, is not about him being happy. Is I was saying without faith, when we have doubt, when we become questioning, it is hard for us to align with God's will or desire. It's not about God being happy. Not about God. It's like God wants to do more for you, but you cannot align with it. God wants to give you an answer, but you cannot get an answer. You cannot align with the will or desire. You know what a will is? A will is something you give to somebody after you have died. It's an inheritance. You cannot enter into God's inheritance. You cannot enter into God's blessing. So when God says you cannot please me, it's not about him taking joy. It's about him giving you. So you cannot enter into his will. It's the questioning. So in rounding this up, how do we become less questioning? This is why I talked about doing this podcast at this time. You see, questioning starts when we do not act early. Questioning starts in the place of idleness. Questioning thrives, just leave a little gap in your time. Just like weeds. Do you know why weeds grow? Weeds grow because you leave space between actual plants that you've planted. A weed cannot grow in a spot that a plant has occupied or a seed has occupied. What it takes advantage of are the gaps. And because we cannot plant without gaps, weeds take advantage of the gaps. It is the gaps in our time that allows weeds to grow in our lives. It's the idle moments. It's the moments of doing nothing. Those moments is where we need to be careful. That's why we must act fast. When you read the Bible, God told Abraham, go and sacrifice this child that I've given to you. What does the Bible tell us in the next chapter? It tells us early in the morning, Abraham saddled donkey or horse or whatever and told Isaac, let us go early. Before doubt, questioning, intellect, rationalization of, are you okay? Do you want to go and kill your son? Kicked in. He got himself on the path. I've talked to my wife a lot and she said, this is your podcast. We should make it a video. But I said, my problem with video is I can't go and do it immediately. Because I'm like, I have to set up, dress up, comb my hair, take my bath, stuff like that, look right. Before I know it, in that small gap, I begin to question what God wants to say. But the way I do the podcast right now, I just come to this space early in the morning. In fact, I want to be coming earlier than this. Because I realize that the earlier I come, the more I just open my mouth and talk before the TA brain kicks in. When the TA brain kicks in, I realize that the later I do my podcast, the more my emotions spill in. Those are the podcasts I end up editing. Most of my podcasts, I don't edit, I just put it out straight. But I realize that the ones I edit are the ones I do later in the evening. An anger, frustration, words I don't expect to say will just kick in, will just flow in. I don't express well later in the day because I have thought about it. Does it make sense? Should I say this? Will it offend people? Will it do this? So I'm not allowing God to speak expressly. But the earlier I come, even while I'm still somewhat groggy, kicks in. God kicks in. God speaks. That's why I like my live sessions. If you've ever been on a live Q&A session with me, you enjoy it and I enjoy it because they don't give me time to think. You understand? To say, let me go back. Let me go back and go and research. I just allow God talk. You understand? I love live sessions. I love live sessions. And I think I'll start doing them more. I'll start doing them more. You see, when I talk with people and they ask me questions on the spot, it's hard for me to kick in because the rational, intelligent part of me would want to take time to think and go through the cabinet. But the spirit doesn't need time to think, it just flows. So if you want to be less doubtful, act quickly. Act quickly. I'm telling someone this today, you are listening. When God tells you to do something, write it down. Get a pen, paper, write it down as soon as possible. The earliest you can activate. Set out early in the morning. And you realize that you begin to act more out of faith. And then you realize that as you do that, you would hear God clearly. And God will just begin to talk to you more and more and more and more and more. That's why the Bible tells us those who look at the wind before they cast their seeds, they never do. You just cast. It's in the acting early, before doubt creeps in, before logic creeps in, before your brain creeps in, before analysis creeps in, before questioning creeps in, before going to ask for advice up and down creeps in. That is faith. This is how we move mountains. This is how we move mountains. Our logic is what hinders us and separates us from God. So God has always been there. It has always been our intellect that has separated us. My name is Tola T.A. Alabi, and this is the TA Podcast.